Okay, great. I'll introduce myself again. Hello and welcome to this webinar. My name is Louisa Angel Smith and I work with Ideal as the Organizational Development Manager. If you haven't done so already, please make sure to share with us in the chat box your name, how you learned about the application lab, and what questions you have for us today. For those of you who might not be familiar with Ideal, the Ideal activity is funded by USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance and works to support the United States government's goal of improving food and nutrition security among the world's most vulnerable households and communities. To learn more about how Ideal addresses knowledge and capacity gaps expressed by the food and nutrition security implementing community, you can click on the link in the chat box. It's a privilege to welcome all of you to this information session on Ideal's first application lab for emergency implementers through our cash, voucher, and food learning stream. As many of you already know, this application lab will convene a cohort of 15 to 20 emergency food implementers who will delve into shifting landscape of the project participant targeting as a result of the challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. To begin, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Darren Ottenhoff, who is the Emergency Food Security Senior Specialist for Ideal, and will be presenting on the application lab. After Darren's presentation, there will be time for all of you to ask questions. In the meantime, if you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to post them on the chat box. And with that, I'll turn it over to Darren.
Thanks, Louisa, and good morning, good afternoon to everyone. It's a great pleasure to see all of you guys here, and we're really excited about this pilot opportunity for this application lab, focusing on targeting. It is great to see everyone this early. For me, it's very early. So if you have a chance, like Louisa said, go ahead and turn on your camera for a little bit so everyone gets a chance to see you as well. That'd be great. So by the end of today's session, this is an info session where we're talking about the application lab. You will be able to know what the application, how the application lab can help participants identify tools and resources to support navigating the data analysis discussions and decisions associated with updating beneficiary targeting during COVID-19. Number two, hear from Ideal staff on the application process, who should apply to participate, and the time commitment expected from the application lab participants. And finally, be able to ask follow-up questions on the application lab and application criteria. Just quickly, you might hear this a few times over the coming, during this discussion about the learning stream, the COVID-19 learning stream. Shortly after the COVID-19 crisis hit us, Ideal developed several different learning streams with focus areas that would be important for implementing partners to discuss and learn about how to make adaptations to their programs during the time of COVID-19. This application lab was developed by the cash, voucher, and food distribution learning stream. So we'll go ahead and go over the agenda quick a moment for the rest of this presentation. Go ahead, next slide. So we're going to start out just briefly going over what the application lab is. We're going to talk a little bit about why we're talking about beneficiary targeting. Then we're going to delve into the cohort selection. Then we'll talk about the workshop design, how it's put together, what kind of expectations we'll have. And then we'll move into the timeline from now until the end of the application lab and beyond a little bit. And then we'll spend some time talking about the application process. This is a few-step process that we'll be looking at in order to kind of join the application lab. And finally, at the end, we'll have a good amount of time where we can talk about any of the questions that you may have coming into this info session, or even some that come up during this presentation right now. So as Louisa said as well, if you have any questions that pop up at any point, go ahead and put those into the chat box and we'll address those at that point. Okay, what is this application lab? Um, it's an exercise that's been designed to assist participants to identify shifting contexts, recognize how the needs and those seeking assistance are changing, and how to look at the best adaptation processes and ways to meet the needs of the vulnerable populations that we're working with in our projects. It will convene small learning cohorts to exchange successes and challenges, as well as to discuss tools and resources that you may have used during this process, or if you are beginning a new project and are looking at ways to better understand how to apply targeting approaches. This will also be a great opportunity to learn from people who have already done these processes. The ideal cash voucher food learning stream will facilitate a cohort of field-based emergency practitioners to discuss these challenges with beneficiary targeting during COVID-19 over several different workshops. It'll be about a 5-week period. Okay, next slide. So why are we talking about targeting? We found in the wake of the novel COVID-19 pandemic that humanitarian actors face a new reality in terms of implementing food security interventions. While the efforts to reduce the spread of virus came about, including travel restrictions and stay-at-home orders, it became more and more difficult to address the needs that we see of our beneficiary populations as we're looking at food security, livelihoods, nutrition, and other areas of vulnerabilities. One of the big considerations that we had to take into consideration was the direct and immediate bearing on food security within programs through the lens of COVID-19 and how vulnerability was shifting. Well, there have been hundreds and hundreds of millions of people who are already going to bed hungry. We're looking at an even wider array of our participants and beneficiaries who are being affected, and their household food security is being affected by COVID-19. We're seeing disruptions in movement of people on the ground, closure of markets, restrictions on cross-road trade, stay-at-home orders, and other quarantine requirements that are having an effect on household food security. We can look at 3 kind of sections, groupings of these shifting vulnerability reasons. If we think about household economic changes, either you may have had a household family member who has become sick that used to be a active economic supporter. You might have new family members joining your household who have become sick or are moving because of COVID. We might see some changes in livelihoods opportunities. There's a lot of people who rely on seasonal labor or efforts like that, or access to the market to run a store who have not been able to do those things because of stay-at-home orders or because market instabilities are happening. And within market instability, we're thinking about how goods may have been halted before coming and going within the marketplace, or if there's been currency instability. And we're also looking at how this has an effect on this changing face of vulnerability has an effect on the populations that we're working in within specific projects. We're seeing that vulnerabilities are broadening and more people are becoming vulnerable. And yet within our projects, we don't necessarily have the resources to make everything into blanket coverage for everyone in the area. So we have to look at who is vulnerable, what those vulnerabilities are, and use that to apply our new targeting approaches. Go ahead and to the next slide. One of the most important decisions we can make is in the design of a humanitarian project is deciding who will receive assistance. This was said to me during an interview recently, one that had started about something completely different. It was a different discussion, not about targeting. But the relevance of targeting and understanding the changing face of vulnerability and recognizing the need to match a need with a person with dignity is one of the most important subjects we can talk about right now, and it has significance well beyond our current situation. We're hoping that the lessons we learned today and throughout this application lab will enable us to replicate our successes and build the dignity of our participants in any new and different situations that arise. And we know that new and different situations will arise. Next slide. The cohort selection. It should be noted that space is limited for this application lab. We have found that smaller cohorts can allow for more freedom of conversation, sharing, and learning. In order to foment the greatest and most productive discussions for this topic, we're going to design this classroom to include participants that are able to bring their experiences to an area where they will benefit will benefit the greater community. We are hoping that participants will also be able to share what they learn with their communities and take that back to the communities that they work with every day. The conversations had during the application lab can be replicated with other interested people, and we hope that the lessons and discussions that we have in these workshops are able to grow. For this application lab, we'll be looking at who would be able to best share their experiences and have the most insight into the decision-making processes for the projects that as they are being designed and implemented. We're looking to see what voices from the field have to say, how decisions were come upon, and how conversations around these decisions were being had. Who should apply? We're really looking for anyone can apply, but we're really looking for emergency implementing project staff, technical staff. We're looking for direct implementation emergency program managers. We're looking for other decision makers around the beneficiary targeting. So if you've been a part of the process that designs the targeting approach or looks at some of the vulnerability criteria development within specific projects, we'd love to hear about your experiences throughout this. Our priorities will be given to participants working with activities that are based in country. While we may have suggested roles or titles at some point in this process, I want everyone to remember that we're really looking for types of experiences and what they can share with others. Roles and titles only mean so much, but if you've had an experience of being a part of one of these program design or development efforts and can share with others some interesting lessons, we'd love to hear from you as well. All right, next slide. So for that purpose, again, we are looking for participants who have a familiarity with general targeting and vulnerability guidelines for these activities. We want to have the flexibility to pivot. We want to understand if projects have the flexibility to pivot their approaches, whether you are considering or researching how best to update or adapt targeting criteria, or if your project is in the process of updating your beneficiary targeting, or if you've already completed beneficiary retargeting. So if you're in projects that are in a still design phase, but will be starting soon and have questions about how to best target, this will be interesting for you. And then, of course, the experience from the people who have already done their targeting exercises will be invaluable for the greater discussion for everyone else here. Okay, next slide. The expectations that we have for our participants, as I said, this is several sessions over the course of about 5 weeks. So we want to make sure that a participant can attend all the sessions and contribute to the discussions. This is only going to be as successful as everyone else brings to the conversations that we have. And we're going to be learning from everyone else's experiences or the questions that they have. We want to make sure that participants have the support from their team to share information about the activities with cohort members. So we want to make sure that you are okay with talking about how you designed your vulnerability criteria, how you designed your targeting approach in the projects you're already active in. Or if you have issues and questions for the cohort, you're okay with asking how to specific questions about this process. We also ask that you might be available for 3 to 6 months after the culmination of the application lab for post-adaptation follow-up sessions. So after we've completed the final workshop, We have questions, want to see how this targeting is working, how the adaptation is doing, if we've learned new lessons, if there's successes or failures that could be shared around. We hope that you're able to share that with us afterwards. And we also have an expectation that you'll share learning with your organizations and your broader emergency food security implementing community where you're working from. As I mentioned earlier, we're hoping that these lessons continue to grow and it doesn't just end in the classrooms where we are. Okay, next slide. So we'll take a few moments now to quickly kind of go over how we are putting our application labs together, the focus of what we're going to be talking about, what we're hoping to get out of them, and also what will be necessary to go into these application labs. I've mentioned this application lab was developed and designed by a full team, and beyond just the technical aspect, we have engaged learning experts, communications and design folks, and presentation professionals who was not me. I am not the presentation professional. We came up with the outline and design that we felt would allow for the greatest takeaways. This slide that you're looking at right now is a good outline of the makeup of the full application lab. You'll see that we have 3 workshops and a showcase, and you can kind of see underneath each of the pictures that there are just a brief description of what we'll be talking about in the workshops. And we will have homework in between each of the workshops. And so just to ensure that you guys have a good understanding too, we can get into a little bit more detail about each of the workshops that we're going to be going into. Next slide. So with the first workshop, we're looking to provide a space for participants to go get to know each other and the activities that they represent and the targeting adaptations that they've tried. This is a cohort where there will be a lot of interaction amongst the people, so it'll be great that you start to get to know each other, and we feel this is a possibility for learning opportunities beyond the learning application as well. During this time, we will discuss challenges and key questions that participants will face, either have faced or will face in their targeting adaptation efforts. We're going to articulate themes about the challenges and key questions that are faced. And we're going to start looking at how we can make smaller groups for cohort discussion groups and thematic groups. The participants are going to come together to review information together. And then through an interactive activity, we're going to learn who is together and in this cohort and how these activities and contexts that we're going to be discussing are shared across the whole group. We will have the first, after the first workshop, we will have a few different homeworks for the group where we'll ask you to look at resources that are available for the for discussions with the group. We'll look to have the participants collect additional resources where necessary, and we'll also start to have people start their meetings with their groups, smaller groups, in between the workshop sessions. Next slide, please. So in workshop 2, we're going to look to share the results of each thematic area's discussions around the key questions. So that's going over the homeworks that will be assigned after workshop 1. The groups will discuss the shifting nature of vulnerability in various emergency contexts and the efforts being done to address these through the frameworks offered by the resources that we'll have shared or that the participants will have been using. It's a conversation topic that we'll see a lot during this presentation as well as throughout the application lab, and that is the shifting face, the changing face of vulnerability because of COVID. And it's something to remember in the back of your head as we're having all these discussions, and that is that vulnerability is changing and we need to best understand how we're talking about it. So Also in workshop 2, we're going to be working in our thematic groups to brainstorm potential solutions to questions and challenges that we've been discussing throughout this process. We'll begin this workshop by presenting what we found during our homework period, how we were either answering or further discussing some of the key questions that came up. And then we'll be sharing these out with the rest of the group. Homework from this session will be additional planning sessions with your smaller groups, your thematic groups, as you look to further develop the questions that you're answering and how you start thinking about the targeting approaches that you'll be using or adapting in the coming time within your projects. Next slide, please. So in workshop 3, we're looking to provide the space for peer assist opportunities. And this is where we will have participants who have completed the plan for updating their beneficiary targeting can answer questions posed by the peers. This is our opportunity to let the people who are at different stages in the development of the targeting approach process share their lessons and their learnings with the folks who might be starting right now. You know, they talk about learning being an opportunity to not make the same mistakes or learning from lessons of others. And this is our opportunity to do that. We'll be providing a space for knowledge capture of emerging and promising practices for possible adaptations in related contexts. So if you're coming in a newer spot with your project and you haven't quite gotten to this phase yet, it'll be an opportunity for you to look at some of the steps that others have taken to get to where they are, and also start looking at some of the questions you might not have asked yet for the targeting approach, or some of the vulnerability criteria issues you might be thinking through. Now, through presentation and feedback, groups are going to start gathering input on their proposed approaches. We're going to look at how the wider group can report out on highlighting insights gained in the peer feedback sessions. And we're going to start clustering conversations about the recommendations to see if we can't start seeing trends within areas. Again, there will be some homework after workshop 3. And this is when we'll start, we'll really focus on what session 4 is, which will be the showcase. Small working groups are going to consolidate their recommendations for the guidance and resources that they've used, and we'll really put the efforts, as I said, into preparing for the showcase. Next slide. That brings us to workshop 4, which is the storytelling showcase, which will feature participants' journey of adapting their beneficiary targeting, in addition to other adaptations that may have been made as a result of COVID-19. So this session is going to have a little bit wider of an audience than just the cohort that have been participating in the workshops. In your smaller thematic groups, you will be developing your entries into this showcase, and we'll see that as a poster session. And this will allow participants to share lessons learned and to take questions from outside listeners on the showcase that might ask about some of the efforts that you have pursued. We might have breakout groups that are hosted by some of the cohort members to look at the challenges that were identified, to answer questions about some of those challenges, or further describe some of the successes as well that could have been described. As far as the overarching timeline goes for the workshops and this learning application, this table, and we could share at a different time as well, but we'll have those 3 workshops. Workshop 1 and 2 are a week apart. And we're looking at these workshops to be 2 to 2.5 hours each. The 3rd workshop is at December 1st, and that's 2 weeks after the 2nd workshop. And then 2 weeks after that is for the showcase on December 15. Now we're expecting there to be about 2 to 3 hours of work each week for each of the sessions here. And we gave a little bit more space between workshop 2 and 3 and 3 and 4, just to allow you to really delve into some of the efforts that are going to be necessary with your thematic group. We also wanted you to have enough time to put together everything that was going to be necessary for the showcase on December 15th. Next slide. So the application process, it does have a few steps to it. And as I mentioned, not everyone, we will only have a finite number of participant slots open. It should only take a few minutes to go through the process. It might seem burdensome, but so we have an open application link set up, and we'll show you what is involved then in a moment. But the applications are being accepted until this Thursday, October 29, after which we will close the link and we'll go through to nominate the applicants who will move on to the participation in the application lab. We will inform everyone by November 5. We will also be sending out some homework and some resources that can be useful for the first workshop prior to the first workshop, which we're tentatively having scheduled for Tuesday, November 10. So here is just a quick look at what the applications look like. It should only take a few minutes to complete, but we're just looking for names. The activity country that you're in will be interesting for us, and the activity name that just kind of helps us understand which project it is that you are working on. The start date and the end date. This is really just to help us understand at what portion, where in the targeting adaptation phase you are, or where you are when COVID hit. And it gives us a really good understanding of kind of where your project is with relation to the efforts that we're going to be undergoing within the workshops. Then the context description, which is explaining the emergency that the activity is responding to, also helps us understand how the thematic groups can fit together, how people might be similar in other areas, and some of the different lessons that we could be learning. And then we do want to understand how COVID has affected your program. I think this is going to be a wider discussion throughout each of the workshops, and it's going to be a great opportunity for others to learn from the efforts that you've gone through. This will help us group people together and also understand, too, some of the lessons that might be learned from the wider cohort that's participating in this application lab. Okay. So at this point, we want to turn it over and ask if anyone has any questions, either from the presentation or you might have had questions during the registration process. Feel free, anything that can make it easier for y'all, we hand it over to you.
As Darren mentioned, we do have some questions from the registration, from the information session registration form. But before we get to that, if there are any questions from this group right now that we should address, please feel free to type them into the chat, or you can unmute yourself and we can address them directly. None yet. Okay, but perhaps we could just start with the questions from the registration, and as if anything sparks up as we're speaking, we can address those questions. So Darren, one of the questions that we received during the from the registration, and this is sort of a two-part question, was from somebody who wasn't sure who from their team should apply, So they were wondering how they should decide. Also, they wanted to know whether staff from the headquarters office or regional office that support emergency programs on the ground would be eligible to apply. Can you answer that for us?
Sure. So we recommend that team members who make decisions about the beneficiary targeting should apply to participate in the application lab. So if you have a full wide-reaching team, for example, if you have an emergency program funded by BHA or what used to be Food for Peace, and the full team is interested, we really want to hear about from your team who it is who kind of decided the targeting approach, who went through the data and said, here's our vulnerability target criteria that we're looking at. So the people who brought that discussion to the fore for the development of the program, we're very interested in hearing from. Now, as far as headquarters or where the location of the office is, participation, I think I mentioned a couple of times, we really would like to hear from in-country folks. However, I also recognize that it frequently can be regional offices or headquarters team members who are designing and developing the targeting criteria, and the ones who are able to kind of relay what vulnerability criteria is to their team members. So we would also be interested in hearing about what your experiences are in this process. If you're involved in that process of developing the vulnerability criteria and the targeting approach, sure, absolutely, go ahead and apply, because we would like to hear some of your experience as well, and I think it would be applicable to other participants as well.
And Rodwell just posted a question, and they would like to know, is this strictly limited to the emergency programs? There are some development program staff who would be interested and do work with targeting vulnerability criteria.
That's a good point. And there are some great and interesting points to be brought up within the development realm as well. For this application workshop, we are prioritizing emergency programs. Just again, it's limited space. But so there may be opportunities for development actors, but we have found that there are differences at times with how and when you make adaptations within emergency programs as opposed to development. So at this point, we are prioritizing emergency programs.
Great. Anybody else from the group would like to add any questions? Okay, then I'll turn it back to our registration questions. We have a shy group today, but that's okay. One of our registrants was asking if it looks like their project has already completed their adaptation, but they were wondering if they can still participate in the application lab.
Well, that would be if your project has already completed an adaptation we'd certainly want to hear from you about how you went through that process, maybe what you learned from going through that process. That's a very valuable voice to hear if you've already gone through it. And I think that some of the people who might be starting that process of developing their targeting approach would certainly love to hear from you as well. So definitely we'd like to have you participate in this application lab.
All right. And one other question that we received from the registration form is do we have a restriction in the number of people from one organization that can participate in the application lab?
So we don't. And of course, we do want a good diversity of participants within the application lab. But instead of looking at organizational, we're really looking at projects and context diversity. So maybe we look at one or two people from a project, but we'll probably try to limit the number of projects. Organizationally speaking, as whoever wants to apply certainly can. But we do want to see the different contexts represented and the different projects represented to really add the richness to the discussion that every one of the different projects can bring.
Thank you. And I am, apologies, I'm going to butcher this name, but Abdel Kader, they would like to know whether the the applicants need to come from programs that are financed by USAID or not.
Sure. Now, we work largely with BHA-funded emergency food or food security projects. That being said, targeting is something that's important across the board. Beneficiary selection, very important. So if you do have other funded projects, whether it's WFP or some of the other emergency food security project funds, sure, it does not need to be BHA funded. Because we do certainly see that there's value across the board in these lessons, and as well as some of the lessons that you may be bringing to this table. So if you do have other funded, go ahead and apply. I'm sure it'll add some very interesting insights to the greater community.
Are there any other questions from today's group that we should address? Anyone else? Well, if no one else, we can perhaps do one more question from the registration form. And this one is with regard to oh, sorry, I lost where I am. Can you explain to us that somebody wanted to know what kind of support and resources will be available between the workshops? And you've spoken in your presentation about having some homework in between the three different workshops leading up to the Showcase in the end. Can you talk a little bit about what participants of the application lab can expect in terms of support in between those workshops?
Sure. That's a very good question. All right. So I think one of the positives and one of the things that we're looking at the application lab too is this will be somewhat of a guided discussion as well. So before we end each workshop, and before we start the homework sessions, we'll send you into those sessions ready to approach the questions that we ask. So if there are necessary resources for you to review and have ready for your discussions, we'll make sure that those are available. If you have questions along the way, we'll share my email address with the community after this session and then throughout too. So if there are any questions throughout this period that you have about something we talked about in a workshop, or how to approach certain aspects of the questions that we're asking, or even if you want to share some of the resources that you've had available. I'm available to talk or to share some of these maybe over emails quickly too. And I'll be honest too, like there are going to be times when, say, you guys ask better questions and I'm able to respond to. However, as I mentioned, we have a team that's developing and designing this workshop. And so the power of all of us together are there to respond to any questions you might have. So any questions that pop up along the way, we're here to respond to and walk you through it or walk the greater community through those questions.
Are there any other questions from the group that we should address?
Hello?
Hi.
Oh, yes, hello.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the presentation. The presentation was very clear. I think I'm actually very clear in terms of who should participate. And the other thing that I just wanted to comment on was, yes, you talked about the shifting nature of the vulnerability. Recently, Kay did an external RGA evaluation. One of the things that came out is that it's not only about COVID, but there are multiple emergencies that have actually occurred. So the external evaluation was saying, why are you only focusing on COVID, especially if there are other multiple or macroeconomic, whatever, crises that are happening, especially when you're looking at the the sub-Saharan Africa. So it might be those are some of the issues that you might actually need to factor in. And then also in terms of beneficiary selection, I actually had a conversation with somebody from Somalia, and they were talking about, you know, yes, we have got our own matrix in terms of beneficiary selection, but USA also has its own. And they were talking of some members who are actually vulnerable because of USAID guidelines. They will not be considered. So I think maybe it would also be an opportunity for you to be able to discuss fully in terms of what are some of the challenges that country offices are facing, especially those that are receiving support from USAID. Thank you very much. I thought I just needed to discuss those two issues. The one, the multiple crises that are impacting, and for them, COVID becomes such a smaller thing, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. Thank you.
Those are wonderful points. Thank you. And so true. You think about so many of the different contexts we're working in where already there was an emergency before COVID came. And the emergencies that we're working in are so complex these days. It's multiple things. It is economic, it is social, it's natural, all together. So it's a very good point. And to your point about, you know, everyone having different resources that help them define vulnerability and the targeting. That's one of the reasons that we kind of put this workshop together, is everyone we talked to was having using different resources, didn't fully understand some of the other resources they were talking about. And you're right that with the shifting, I mean, we want to kind of refocus, make sure that we're using the same language when we're talking about this, and we're talking about the same people, and making sure that we're not missing out on anyone. So I greatly appreciate your point. Thank you for bringing that up.
Any other questions from the group today? Well, with that, I think we can start wrapping up. It's always nice to end a little early. Thank you to everyone for participating. We know it's difficult to take time from every busy day, so we appreciate that. We will share the question and answer document with everyone's questions and answers after the session. Before we end, we would like everyone to complete a brief poll so that we can determine everyone's interest in the application lab. You should see the poll on your screen now. I'll give you a minute to complete. So it looks like we have some interesting folks that will want to participate in the application lab and think about others within their team that they would want to nominate. Okay. All right, we'll share the results when everyone is done. Okay. So everyone's done voting? Okay. All right, so it looks like there's quite a bit of interest in applying for the application lab, which is great. We're excited about that. And the second question was about whether you'd be willing to, interested in nominating a colleague. 60% of you said yes, so that's great. And it looks like no one has any other further questions. All right, that's terrific. In terms of next steps, we're putting together the landing page for the application lab in the chat so you can access the information. We're also sharing the link to the application form, which is due by close of business on Thursday, October 29th. A reminder that the application to participate only takes 5 minutes to complete. You can also contact Darren. We'll add his email address to the chat in case you have any other questions. All right, so that brings us to the end of today's information session.